The United College Distinguished Visiting Scholars Scheme is made possible through the generous support of the college's endowment fund. This program allows United College to invite internationally renowned scholars to Hong Kong, where they deliver public lectures and engage with our staff and students. This year, we are truly privileged to welcome Professor Jacob Soll, a leading historian, public intellectual, and university professor at the University of Southern California. Let's give Professor Soll a very warm welcome. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's lecture, Professor Stuart McManus, who is a professor in the Department of History. Professor McManus has graciously nominated Professor Soll for this prestigious DVS honor. Professor McManus will now introduce Professor Soll and the topic of today's lecture. Please join me in welcoming Professor McManus. Professor McManus, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, students, it is my great honor and privilege to once again introduce our United College Distinguished Visiting Scholar, Professor Jacob Soll, University Professor at the University of Southern California, where, probably uniquely in the world, he holds concurrent appointments in the departments of philosophy, history, and accounting. Professor Soll has authored several influential books, including studies of Niccolò Machiavelli's political thought and French economic policy in the age of Louis XIV. His acclaimed 2014 book, The Reckoning, provides a comprehensive history of accounting and its impact on the rise and fall of nations. His recent Free Market, The History of an Idea, is a bestseller in multiple countries and is required reading for all of us interested in the past, present, and perhaps uncertain future of global trade and interconnected, free-wielding financial markets. Professor Soll earned his PhD from Magdalen College, Cambridge. Over his distinguished career to date, he has taught variously at Cambridge, Princeton, Rutgers, the European University Institute in beautiful Fiesole, Italy, and of course at USC. However, in his work, I would venture that you see most clearly the influence of his time spent studying French cooking in Paris. His writing transcends the disciplinary ingredients of his training and the surprising combination of his departmental affiliations. It delights the palate and appeals to all of us who appreciate a carefully interpreted historical source or data set and the thrill of a delicately spread argumentative mousse. A scholar, a public intellectual, and a man of the world, if you can't wait for him to plate his next book, you can enjoy an amuse-bouche by reading his regular articles in the New York Times, Politico, and the Boston Globe. Those of you who move in policy circles might also from time to time catch a glimpse of him cooking up new ideas alongside important figures such as Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez and former British Prime Minister Gordon Brown. So now, let us, as it were, finish the appetizer, clear the table, and please join me in welcoming the main course, Professor Jacob Soll, who will speak to us on the topic of A Royal Road to Wealth, how Monsieur Colbert built the first large-scale modern market.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you to the leaders of the college for inviting me here, and thank you to the staff and the students. It has been really wonderful. I mean, this last week and more here in Hong Kong has just been great. I love this university. It's a wonderful place. I hope, students, you appreciate how good you have it here. It's really a special place. This is my second time back, and it's just so wonderful to be here. I really love it. And continuing Stuart's theme, I have gained 3 kilos. And so, with great joy, let me tell you, with great joy. And I've learned a lot, too. And it's kind of funny that, or not funny perhaps, but kind of intense that I'm giving this speech today given the sort of political situation of the world. This work that I'm presenting to you, because is this on? This work that I'm presenting to you basically came from a realization. I've been spending a lot of time in East Asia. And if you're from the West, or I don't even know if the West exists anymore, if you're from Europe or America, and you haven't been to East Asia, you don't know East Asia, you don't understand the economics of the world. It's impossible. This is now the richest place in the world. We're already into the Asian century. In fact, today it's just clear, this week, that this is the Asian century. We're deep in it now. We've already entered into it. And I wrote this book, interestingly, because there is an idea in America and Europe that if you go to and study with economists, and you might even have some here, the idea is that the way to wealth for a country is simply by freeing markets. That's it. And letting people trade back and forth. That's it. If you just free people, they will just get rich. And sometimes that's kind of true, but it turns out there's a big backstory to that. And I thought, that's funny, because I'm going to get to this guy soon. I'm going to get to him too. But it's kind of interesting, because East Asia didn't have that history. There's nowhere in East Asia that really starts from nothing. By the way, it's the same in Europe. England doesn't just get rich because it's free. It does all sorts of trade policies. It does all sorts of subsidies. There are some tariffs, not incredibly strong, but there's an industrial strategy for hundreds of years in England that actually slowly bears fruit. And this history, there's been a kind of fight over it, and still today, there is a battle over, for example, there's a battle over, was the East India Company a free company or a state company? Was Holland a free market state, and was its company a free company, a private company, or was it a state company? And we're finding more and more that there's state involvement. Not always huge amounts, but more than anyone had told us, okay? And so one of the things that kind of struck me as I would sit and listen to economists was, first of all this wealth in East Asia, which, again, I don't think people always realize in Europe or even America. I don't think they know unless they're really involved. We're in this new age, and these graphs just show it. But there's another thing that's incredible, is that, and I'm going to have to defend a little bit China's economy, because over and over again, I've heard two things in the United States. The first is that China got rich because it had a totally free market. I was just like, that's not what happened, okay? It's just not what happened. And China will not get rich if it has any state involvement. But anyone who knows the history of how China got rich knows that there's industrial strategy involved. Then China goes on a downturn, and many people in America kept saying, well, China's not going to actually do well. But somehow, if you start following the headlines and the indices, China, sure, it has its challenges, but over and over again, we keep seeing that despite certain things, China is dominating in all these leading markets. And I'm not saying this to support China or be against America or do anything like that. I'm just trying to point out a fact, that China is starting to lead in major world industries that are the central industries, one after the next. And there are tariffs and there are subsidies. However, how can I say, and there are problems and there are issues, but the fact of the matter is this data shows that the old story of how the West got rich by simply being free is just something we need to reconsider. It's just something we need to reconsider. And we need to think about how the West got rich and now how Asia got rich. And so basically, I wrote a book about this. And I did it with East Asia in mind. And so this is an interesting story. When I wrote this book, I had no idea what would happen, but it was attacked vociferously by many places in the United States. over and over again. For 14 months, I was attacked and attacked. In Europe, and especially Britain, the book was very well received, which I thought was interesting. And in Asia, it has been very, very well received. So it's a really sort of interesting cultural experience of writing Western economic history with an Asian angle, which I thought was interesting. I thought that Americans would be more interested. There was interest in it, but it was a very violent fight around the book. And in the middle of that fight, when I was getting attacked every day, I was invited by Professor Beatty to come here. And that was when things kind of changed, because the book started coming out in Asia, and I started receiving more support for it. And I just thought there was a cultural difference, not in what people do, but how they tell their story. And I had clearly told the story, perhaps in too much of an Asian way. And so the book has come out recently in Japan, and it was very well received in Japan. And this is ironic, by Japanese conservative ruling parties. They liked this book, which was seen as conservatives in America as a treason, literally. So it's very interesting how economic thought is very cultural. And that's something to think about when you're going off to your jobs, is how people think about economics and what role culture plays in your economics. So I'm a historian of France, and we have an old story that, let me just jump to this. This is another set of graphs that I wanted to show you. We kind of have an old story that England got rich and France failed. And I always thought that was kind of an odd story, because I'd grown up in France, and I didn't really see France as a failure. In fact, I always noticed that France had, at least when I was alive, higher living standards, much better food, much better public transportation, and better health care, at least in my lifetime. So I was like, this is a funny story. And I was like, how is it that France supposedly failed and England won if France today and England, they're all struggling, but how did they get to these points if France failed? How do economies get rich? Is it by pure laissez-faire, or is it more complicated? And is there a precedent to the East Asian approach? And I began in my work in the archives to realize that France was a very good way of understanding a precedent, a very early precedent to East Asian economic development. So how did the West industrialize? These are huge, huge questions. Should we be just comparing East Asia to Britain? Actually, we could if we looked at Britain the way economic historians are doing it now. And then I began to actually think more that France, in fact, was much more important than we think in understanding the history of wealth. And that is if you look at it from a more Asian standpoint. So this is this famous graph of the Great Divergence, or so it's called. We're thinking it's more of a complicated convergence. But here's England, okay, and here's France. And I was like, this isn't so bad. I mean, if France failed, this isn't such a bad failure. And so I dug more into it. And I went to these guys. I am an expert. I spent 16 years, and this is an interesting thing, 16 years in the archives. People don't always have time to do this anymore in their busy lives. But when I was younger, I spent 16 years in his archives and his archives without stopping. 16 years of reading tens of thousands of pages of archival material. And what that allows you to do, this archival material, you guys, was the essential material of the building of the French state, which is one of the greatest states in the history of modern times. And so I began to see things, almost like a doctor dissects a body. I began to see how the body worked. I began to see places where the body didn't work. I began to find things that people had not seen or they had sort of covered up. And I began to see that there had actually been a remarkable project of growth that they had come up with, mostly Colbert. How did that happen? How can I get this back up there, you guys? Is there a tech person? You guys? You guys, can you help me out here? So basically what happened so essentially, what happens is I started finding that France, in fact, had done something that no country had ever done in let's say, the pre-modern period. It had been a country that had been very behind. It had been a country that was behind because of civil war and war. Its industrial base had gotten destroyed. And what happened is Colbert and Louis XIV come to power, and they say, we need to build, we see these other countries that are rich around us, that are not far from us, Holland, England, Northern Italy. We need to build an industrial base, and we need to build an economic base. Even more, we need to build a market. And Colbert, you guys, in economic thought, is considered the representation of state-run economies. And there's no question, he believes the state is going to build a market. But in those documents, in those piles of paper, I found that he said the state needs to build up its economy so that it can compete and there can be liberty of commerce. So he did believe in a version of free trade. He just believed that the state actually had to help the country get there. It was so uncompetitive, he said, that if things were to continue as they were, the rich neighbors would steal not only all of the goods from the country, but all the labor would just leave the country. And in turn, northern France, which was next to Holland, was essentially emptied out. And he had some statistics that because there was so much trade and industry in Holland, all the artisans, the workers, and all the goods, the actual goods had just gone to Holland. It was empty. It was desolate. So he said, look, we can't have that. It's undermining the country. We're going to build a market. We're going to build this entire thing, and then we can trade freely. And I was like, that's not what we've been told. That's a sort of remarkable story. So they came up with a strategy. And the strategy is quite extraordinary. They created what I consider to be, until this day, the greatest overall brand in history. I mean, I was just in Macau yesterday, and I saw a giant French casino, and the back of the casino is loosely based on a version that comes out of this building. The idea of luxury is still a French concept. You guys know who the third richest man in the world is, who's not the head of a country. Does anybody know who he is? The third richest man in the world is actually French. I know it's hard to believe. Doesn't make computers. He doesn't make software. What's he make? Anybody know? Yeah, he makes champagne and handbags and perfume. And then the other two biggest companies in the world for luxury are also French. When you walk through Macau, when you walk through Hong Kong, when you walk through any airport in the world, all you do is see his brands. They own them all. Hermes, everything. Actually, it's 4 companies that own all the luxury in the world. And this comes from this project. You have to admit, that's a kind of astounding industrial vision. I want to kind of talk about this. So basically what happens is France was poor. Louis XIV had come to power. He was a great king. He was somebody who was very proud, but when he became king, he found he had no money in his coffers. And so he wanted to build things up. And so they literally start to industrialize. And this is a story I looked into it. I dug into archives. I dug into articles. It was absolutely fascinating. Since the Middle Ages, the things that had made countries wealthy was this, wool. Everybody needed it. Everybody needed it to clothe themselves. And so France was behind. England had actually moved forward. And so the French actually start putting together new looms in a city called Rouen. They start making lace in Lyon. And I don't know if you've heard of French lace, but the last French lace was made in France a few years ago, and now it's all made in China. But it's still designed in France on computers, which is kind of crazy. I mean, this story. But so he starts creating all these textiles trades, and they actually create a loom that has a shuttlecock that moves in a particularly good way. These aren't the best looms in the world, but they make a lot of them. And if you look at the statistics, they start creating more wool than anybody else. And they start looking to make quality, but they're smarter than that. This is their branding thing. They start connecting it, and this is actually Louis XIV, with fashion. And I don't know if you know anything about Louis XIV. He's a troubled guy in some ways, but extremely brilliant. He's another person, if you go through his archives, You are able to see his intelligence, his problems, but he's a very brilliant guy. He actually invents ballet. He invents modern fashion. And so what they start doing is he brings all of his noblemen to Versailles. He doesn't want the noblemen out fighting in a feudal way and creating chaos. He wants power over all the powerful people in his country. So they come to Versailles, and he says, you have to dress in these crazy clothes, which come from his basically ballet costumes. Nobody dressed like this before. A nobleman was a soldier and came in with a leather vest and with big riding boots and swords, okay? Now they're coming in dressed like ballet dancers, essentially. And I want you to see on these costumes, these cost the equivalent today. I've tried to price these. If you really had a fancy costume at Versailles, it would be the equivalent of a huge sum of money in those days. And what Louis also came up with was an idea that you would actually change the fashion. So every several months, he just said, no more wearing of the color gray. So you had the equivalent of a few $1 million in suits. You'd have to throw them out and buy another couple $1 million in suits. He'd throw a party at Versailles. You'd have to buy suits for 5 days of parties. As he did this, the rest of Europe began to look and see. These parties, there were great playwrights, there were great musicians, and I'm going to talk about that. And this brand started emerging, okay? This is, if you want a state brand, we haven't actually had so much state branding in the modern age, but it's quite extraordinary, okay? So everyone in Europe starts getting interested in these French luxuries. And this helps the French wool industry. And believe me, the British are very aware of this. And they're very worried about it, and they argue about it a lot. They're like, can we open our markets to France? In fact, their wool's getting better and better. They're creating these luxury goods that everybody wants, and if we open our borders, now we'll be ruined by them. And this is actually, even in the 18th century, there's a concern about this. But there's another thing that Colbert actually does, is they've got the fashion, they've got the luxury, but Colbert comes up with another thing, and I find this really, really interesting. He connects the prestige of the state to research, to science, to culture. And this is really unique. The idea of building a state around a research project. Thinkers like Francis Bacon had talked about it, but no one had actually gone out and done it from scratch. Colbert builds a library. This is his royal library. But you have all the tools of physics, engineering. This stick here, I had a PhD student who's now a professor in Toronto who wrote an incredible PhD about just how high-tech this stick was. This is the measurement stick used to build Versailles. It turns out that Versailles is really hard to build. You need incredible engineering skill to build a building at that scale. You guys know what Versailles is, right? I already put a picture of it. It is the biggest, grandest palace in the world. It's the model of luxury today. It's the models of casinos. It's the model of hotels. It's the model of houses in Los Angeles, okay? But it was built as an actual high-tech project, not just a luxury branding project. So all this machinery, all this engineering, here we have philosophers and poets. We have people doing genealogy. We have people doing more measurements. We have people doing physics. This is an incredible project. This is Colbert's vision of what the state should be. The state should be a center of knowledge, okay? And he really thinks that the prestige of Louis, I want you to think of everything that's going on in this painting, all right? There's Louis in a gold suit, which probably costs the equivalent of millions and millions and millions of dollars, okay? He's got the suit of suits, all right? Here's Colbert introducing him to his scientists. By the way, this is the most high-tech building of the times. It's the observatory, which has been kind of forgotten in France, but at the time, it's the most high-tech building. So I want you to look at the fashion, the luxury, and the science all mixed together. It turns out that this was a project of mixing all of these elements to make France a place that people wanted to buy things from, but they had to go to know things, all right? Today, by the way, I want you to think about this. What are the states, what are the places that you go to have the authority of knowledge to verify things? Well, for some time, you go to Britain for Greenwich Mean Time. For the kilogram, the French have the kilogram. And until a few weeks ago, for things that had to do with science and even the weather, you went to America, but America no longer has a National Weather Service, and actually our Science Foundation sites are down. So it's kind of crazy because America was very much also got built later on this model, all right? They also started doing something fascinating. They started becoming the center of books showing you about scientific knowledge and engineering. So even if the French didn't actually do it, they basically gave you the impression that they knew how to do it. If you wanted to know how to do something, so when you guys go to a university, you still think of these American universities as these places where they know how to do things. You go to Science Magazine, you go to Nature Magazine. There are these authoritative centers of knowledge. They start creating France as an authoritative center of knowledge through publishing all these books. Even if they didn't make the thing, they would actually tell you how to make it. This is another incredible thing, and this happens at your college, and we found that this is one of the secrets to making knowledge and making great research. They start inviting foreigners, and they're the first to really systematically do this. Colbert and Louis start writing letters to all the great scholars of Europe, saying, look, come to Paris, we'll give you, well, this is an amazing one, we'll give you an apartment to live in, a really nice one. We'll give you a lot of money, we'll give you a title of nobility, and we'll give you a lab, okay? It's the dream, everything you want. I mean, this is the first time anyone comes up with this model. This is a kind of model that your university uses right now. You're in a global, international university, and that's one of the reasons I'm here. And also, I think you're here too, so it's very impressive. It works, all right? This is the sort of first person to do this. This guy was the tech guy of, oh, I've done it again, sorry guys. So this guy, Christian Huygens, was kind of the tech guy of his time. He was not a tech bro. He was actually a rather nice fellow. And he was this guy who, he was doing the absolute most important research of his time. He was creating the pendulum clock, which is going to be key to all these different things. And it's this key thing of physics, and it's a key mechanism of a clock that can wind itself. He redoes Galileo's parabola of free fall, and he creates this cycloidal pendulum, and this is used for navigation. It's also used for map making. And why is this important? Because at this time, European powers are still conquering the world. This is an imperial age, for better or for worse. And what the French create is something no one had done before, is longitude. So they actually can measure the world using this in a way that other people can't. It gives them power and authority, all right? So this is big time stuff. Huygens gets to live in the Royal Library. They give him an apartment in the center of power. He's a foreigner, he's from Holland. So they're snatching up the great brains. This is incredibly, I mean, this is so pioneering. Here's a fake image of Louis XIV visiting the Academy of Sciences. Here he is. Look at the ridiculous ballet clothes that he's wearing. Everyone's stuck in these multi-million-dollar suits. There's the observatory. This never happened. He never actually visited the Academy of Science. But he wanted people to think, actually it was Colbert who wanted everyone to think that the king is literally part of the scientific enterprise. Why? It's great for the brand, okay? And Louis was like, yeah, let's do this. This is very smart. They build the observatory. So here it is, you guys. You want high tech. This is 17th century high tech. And you have to admit, this is an impressive building. You've got a super telescope. You've got wind power here. I mean, like, this is incredible. Today, this building is some kind of weird academic club. It's closed to the public. But at the time, they wanted everyone to see that they had the highest tech place in the world. And people saw it. They end up, Colbert, so basically he believes that culture will create wealth. And this is an interesting idea. He founds all of these academies. All of the French Academy in Rome, the Academy of Painting and Sculpture, the Paris Observatory is built by Cassini. All of these are still open today. When I was young, Paris was still a center of knowledge. Today it's not so prestigious anymore. But when I was young, I went to Paris to study because these centers were still so important. The world changes, but all of these were still really, really important. Colbert does something else. He attaches all this science to industry. And there's a famous historian in America who told the story that the European Enlightenment happened when you mixed industry with formal knowledge. It was Colbert's idea to do the fancy science on one end and then have the fishing, the woodworking, the metalworking, flour milling, wine and vineyards, still maybe the one thing the French are actually still dominant in today, painting, textile manufacturing. All of these things he connects also to the scientific enterprise. So the idea is you have a country, a place where people verify things, okay? This authority, so for many, many years, this story was told. At one end, France, the economic failure. On the other end, France, this great place of culture and science. But that's not how they thought about it, and that's not how it worked. And that's not, by the way, how other Europeans saw them. Their prowess in science, their prowess in luxury, ended up being a huge economic driver. They do something else which is absolutely fascinating. Colbert he's thinking about how to build a market, how to make markets work. So one of the things that he notes in his papers is that every time we write a treaty with the Dutch, they somehow do better than we do. They understand international finance better than we do. They understand accounting better than we do. They understand imports and exports, everything. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a giant diplomatic corps. I'm going to make my brother the head of this diplomatic corps, and then train his son so well that he can lead this giant diplomatic corps. It turns out that this diplomatic corps, which is the beginning of modern diplomacy in many ways, is there to write trade treaties. And amongst Colbert's papers, literally a sixth of his papers, 10,000 pages, is based on creating a trade treaty with England. There's not a great book on it. It's one of the most pioneering, visionary things. Why? Because what he wanted to do was to create a treaty so well done that you could actually have free trade between the two countries. But for that, you needed a lot of work. The state had to be involved, and it was a huge project. So in order to get free trade, you needed this high-end state. You needed all these experts. You needed bureaucrats of the highest quality, educated people working for you. And so he creates this incredible diplomatic corps, which serves Louis XIV very well throughout his checkered career. So they slowly start to build this building of buildings. And if you haven't seen it, my slides got a little messed up here. But this building housed about 10,000 people. These fountains, this fountain system, was one of the wonders of the world of engineering. It was destroyed in the French Revolution and was not working again. So when I grew up in France, there were no rules, you guys. When I was a kid, when there was a heat wave, we used to go swimming right here. And there's a reason we went here. It's because the wind would blow and the poop of the geese would get pushed over here. So the water was dirty over here, but it was clean here. And so we'd jump in the water when it was hot. It's like unimaginable now that you would do that, okay? But that's what we did on a hot day. This is so big. This is enormous. These fountains did not work from the 1790s. It was only about 15 years ago that they started working, and I saw them work for the first time. This was considered one of the greatest feats of hydro engineering of all time, and it still is unbelievably remarkable. So you have to look at the scale of this. This is an industrial scale of building. And this literally captures people's imagination. And this is what's so important. It makes people dream. He fills this palace with all these beautiful things, with woodworking, with textiles, okay? And this, as they're doing this, the British are getting worried, and the British are putting up tariffs. Now, the tariffs are not incredibly high, but literally they're very, very worried that this new French stuff that everyone wants, everyone's looking at this giant building, everybody wants it. It's the idea also, markets are about creating desire, okay?
And that's, by the way, something Hong Kong's very good at. Hong Kong is a place of desire, right? It's where you want things, you want a certain life. People come here for the Hong Kong life. So if you think about Hong Kong and how it has worked and how it works, this model is still very much part of it, right? This idea of luxury, of wanting to live in a certain way. And textiles. Hong Kong is a place where you come for clothing and have suits made, right? So look at this. He creates an entire industry to make these tapestries. And by the way, this is very interesting. This is Colbert's family insignia, the climbing snake, okay? And look at all these textiles. He also creates this company, Saint-Gobain, which is a company that will pioneer all sorts of high technologies. It will create the actual the protection that goes on space shuttles. It will do all these things. It was just sued in New Jersey for pollution. So I want you to think about a company that's created in 1665 that's getting sued right now in New Jersey for pollution. It's astounding. This company, and here is this amazing picture, and here are people from the court coming to look at how these guys work. It's going to make this room, which is one of the most famous rooms of all time. This is the Hall of Mirrors in France. And this is quite a room. And in this room, you have crystals, you have glass, you have woodworking, you have actual parquet making for the floors. And the whole ceiling is covered with paintings that come from this school in Rome that they've created. People desire to be in this room. It's a feat, I didn't realize, it's also a feat of startling engineering to build the room this long, to have it work, to have it not droop. It's kind of incredible. He starts literally looking how to create an international market, and he creates this free port in Marseille. So he actually creates a free market here. All the other ports that are around Marseille have to pay for this, because whenever you do a free trade zone, other places actually have to kind of support it. This allows the French to dominate trade in the Mediterranean. So this is market building. Versailles, luxury, they're all attached to this idea of creating a market. And here, you guys, there are several pioneering free ports. This is the most successful one, and Colbert creates it. Colbert trains his son, and this is very interesting for you students. He trains his son, to master the art of administration, but he also trains him in physics to understand how bombs fall, because they're starting a military industry. He's an expert in painting. When he dies, he has one of the greatest painting collections in the world. He dies very unhappy, and I'm going to tell you why. First of all, Colbert is very mean to him and pushes him too hard, but Louis XIV will actually do something quite cruel to him. I don't have the picture. He also trained him how to build a boat. So this is this fancy prince. He's married to a cousin of the queen, and his father sends him to a port and says, I want you to study the nails. I want you to study the cloth. I want you to actually study everything so that you know how to build a boat. You can actually come to the palace, you can dance, you can drink the champagne, you can do all these things, but you can also build a boat. This is a remarkable feat. And by the way, he learns how to do that. We have all of those papers. Oh, here it is. Here's Colbert's son's sketch of there are just these books of boat building. And we have all the nails and all the sails. It's really extraordinary. Colbert also literally starts writing trade laws, so that even if you're English or you're Dutch, the laws that you use for business, for trade, are going to come out of France. This is market building. He also creates the first widely used book of business administration. So this is the first book for businessmen that becomes used throughout Europe. And in fact, this is one of the great ironies, is that the English will adopt this book, and it will be the best-selling book for businessmen. There are many, but this one becomes very, very important. And this guy, Malachi Postlethwaite, is really interesting. He's someone to read because he is someone that looks to Colbert's project and understands it. And he says, the French are not as good as we are in certain things, but they're better in others. We have to learn from them. They are creating a market. And he explains it. And he actually takes this book Colbert wanted done, he translates it and creates, he creates this business manual that gets used throughout England. And over again, he warns the government of England, we cannot underestimate how good the French are at things. They're behind us, but they have created desire, they have created these high-tech things, and they know what they're doing. And so it's super, super interesting. He's been kind of forgotten, but going back and reading him gives you a sense of just how remarkable this 20-year rise of France was. So you might say that France was the first country in history to get rich in several decades. And that made me think of Big China. And I was like, this is really interesting. There's a parallel between Big China, East Asia, and this French example, because they get rich really, really fast. Now, by the way, Colbert wants everyone to be literate in accounting, in business, language. So he's doing big culture, but he's also doing business at the same time, and he sees them as connected. This image I just find absolutely fascinating. So this is a rope-making machine. But someone actually, I think, said to me that rope-making machine might actually be English. It didn't matter if it was English or French or Dutch. It went into the French books. They kind of claim all the knowledge as theirs. And so they can sell themselves as the experts. And so there's another point in England that's really interesting. And this is later Daniel Defoe writing. They don't know what the French are the best at and what they're not the best at. And so someone like Daniel Defoe, who's this brilliant writer and brilliant business mind, but he's also a brilliant author in 18th century Britain, he says, we simply cannot underestimate them at any point. And because he's reading these books. Now, just for the record, America, when it's founding itself, is very much, it founds its constitution on the idea of having no king, no Louis XIV. Many of my friends have researched this. Louis XIV is the anti-model for the political system of the United States. But the economic model is not England. Alexander Hamilton wants to be the new Colbert. And I had an undergraduate student doing research for me, you guys, who went through the papers of the founding fathers of the United States and found that they were ordering busts of Colbert and another French guy to put in their offices. They weren't ordering busts of Adam Smith. They were ordering busts to put on their tables of Colbert and a guy named Jacques Necker. So this is really interesting. They rejected the political system, but they emulated the economic system. And this is, again, something you won't read in many history books and might be really upsetting within the mythology of how America gets rich. In fact, Alexander Hamilton writes this founding book on economics as a literal rebuttal to Adam Smith and a defense of Colbert. And in it, he says, we need small tariffs, no more than 2 or 3%, sometimes 10%, but even that's extreme. And we take that small amount of money and we put it not into every industry, but into industries that are infant, like metalworking and actual weaponry, because we don't have these industries. But it has to be really careful, he says, because if your tariffs get too high, it will destroy supply and demand. It's an amazing book. I mean, this is a super smart book. So small tariffs, strategic subsidies. And all the while he's saying, this is what I understood the French to do. And this guy, Adam Smith, who says that we're just going to free everything and it will work, he said, we don't make anything in America, we'll be destroyed. We actually need to close our borders a bit and we need to start making things. But very carefully. So this book is a book to read. His report on the subject of manufacturers. It's an astounding book. And it's basically based on the French. Now, here's the problem, is that Louis XIV gets bored. He gets bored of the parties, he gets bored of the luxury, he gets bored of the science, and he goes a little crazy because he's got a lot of power. So he starts making war, okay? And this is another myth, is that Colbert wanted these wars. Colbert doesn't want the wars. He thinks they're bad for business. So he begs Louis XIV not to do it. Who does Louis attack? Is it an enemy who's threatening his country? No, it's Holland. It's the rich country. And he's grumpy because they're making money. So look at him in his ridiculous clothes. He never goes near the battles. But he starts attacking Holland, which is a commercial country. And he starts putting giant tariffs on them and attacking them. So Louis XIV, in the end, starts destroying this very market that Colbert starts building with giant tariffs and wars, okay? And so here we have Louis, once again, he would attack Utrecht. And it was a show because Utrecht would hand him some gold and he'd leave. And if you went any northern in Holland, they would just flood it. So it was very theatrical. He just wanted to win. He wanted to make giant golden statues of himself. And basically, at this point, he starts undermining the French economy with war and giant, irrational, non-strategic tariffs. Luckily, no one would ever do anything like that again. We have Louis XIV as a model. We know that doesn't work, right? So luckily, we've learned from history, right? Louis, war after war after war, bankrupts France. Even more, he becomes terrified of going to hell, that God hates him. And so he wants to have his country have one religion, so he persecutes a religious minority, the Protestants of all people. He persecutes Protestants. And here he sends soldiers into their houses to physically attack them, to force them to convert. And this is actually the first example we have of cleansing in Europe. We now think it's around 400,000 people are tortured, killed, and moved out. And that's why you find so many French names in England and Germany and actually parts of the United States, is because hundreds of thousands of these Protestants are forced out. He makes Colbert's son do this. And Colbert's son knew that his father thought this was a bad idea, and he starts drinking too much white wine and becomes an alcoholic. Like, you find this out in the papers. It's like a super tragic story. And so this is sort of how it ends up, is this incredible project of Versailles becomes obsessed with war, tariffs, religious cleansing, and you start having famine and slaughter, and millions of people die of famine. Millions of people die in war-related deaths. And this wonderful, glittering project that began in Versailles turns into a nightmare, all right? And France goes broke. It's bankrupt. When Louis XIV dies in 1715, people actually celebrate. The streets are empty, and secretly people are celebrating. So this great king, the most famous of all the European kings, his death is celebrated by a hungry, bankrupt, and bled people. So it's a crazy story. Now, what's interesting in all this is, why did France persist? How did France survive this reign of this destructive king, this brilliant but destructive king? And I've been really interested because I've always sort of told this story. We've got these two sides of a coin, an incredibly successful king and then a king who destroys everything, so much so that the founding of the United States is partially based on not doing what he does. And what I now really think it is it was this giant research machine, is that he never fully destroys his research. France will still fund research, France will still celebrate research. All those research institutions will still exist after Louis XIV's death. So even if France has a terrible, non-functioning political system, it still has a giant research basis. And this is an interesting statistic. In the 18th century, as England starts taking off, really even in 1706, even Philadelphia, well, it's part of Great Britain, they take off. The first industrial revolution is extraordinary. France lags behind, but still creates as much scientific discovery so that when the time comes, France can also once again be that other country. And in the 19th century, there are times that France is richer than Britain. Why? Because it does so much invention, so much science. So one of my conclusions from this story was that if you want to get rich, if you want to have a country that's prosperous, if you want to have a country that can do amazing things, you might have problems politically, but if you fund research, this is always a sign of the health of a country. A country can always keep going because it's focusing on the future. A country that undermines its research is in existential trouble. And that's why France did not go down. It suffered for 100 years of bankruptcy, of being behind, but the research and the intellectual life stayed there, and it flourished, and it allowed France to eventually come into the modern world. And so this is the crazy thing. It's research and culture that might be the source of how you get rich. Not just free trade, but research and culture. And this comes from state investment, but also having a flourishing world of not just science, but also writing, communication, plays, media, all right? Art, religious art, all of these things are absolutely key, and radical thought too. Allowing radical thought allows France to end up succeeding in the future. So am I saying we should have a state-run economy? Not at all. I'm saying that the state absolutely has to be good and professional at helping markets run, and also over and over again, there's one thing that we've seen is that states have to pay for research. And if the state does that and does a lot of research budget spending, you will see success at one time or another if they do it well. And so that sort of brings us back to this city, which is such an interesting city in the history of the world. It's a meeting point. It's a great center for trade and capitalism. It's a flashpoint that people argue about, but it also is, as we all here show, it's one of the world's greatest centers of research. Hong Kong has some of the leading universities in the world. This is a top 50 research university. Do you know how important that is? That literally shows that Hong Kong, I mean, very few countries have leading, America has almost all the leading research universities. There are a few in Europe, but Hong Kong has several. That's crazy, okay? So this place kind of backs up that model. And so in some ways, this is an argument or a way of saying, for Hong Kong to succeed, it's not just about banking, it's not just about trade, it's also about what you guys are doing here, which is research, culture, and learning. That is actually what I take away from my research. That is how you actually create more than just an industrial state, but a lasting state that's sustainable. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Soll, for that insightful and thought-provoking presentation. Please remain on stage as we move into the Q&A session. We will need a few minutes to set up the stage, so kindly remain on stage for a while. I would like to invite Professor McManus to join us on stage and moderate the Q&A session. Professor McManus, please.
So thank you so much, Professor Soll, for that really wonderful and wide-ranging presentation. It was really a luxury for us to be able to hear your insights. So we have plenty of time for questions, students. If you put your hand up, then we have roving mics that will be able to pick up your question. Please do wait for the mics, though. So the floor is open.
Questions, you guys. I've threatened this last time. If you don't ask me questions, I'll start crying. Okay, so really, I'll feel so bad that you really have to ask the questions. And the other day, I came down into the crowd. I can't do that today. So you really need to ask the question. I'll be just so sad. I'll go home to America just feeling extra sad. So I don't want to leave anyway. Questions?
At the back on the right.
Okay. As you can see, the research will definitely enhance the economy. Would you rather support that or agree that actually military is probably better for the country, especially when that country have strong military force or really high budget for the military equipment? Which is better, if one for research or another for the military?
It was all interrelated. So everything you see here is interrelated. He had the poets and the playwrights integrated with his engineers, building houses, but also in the end, that he didn't build the actual military, but he built the Navy, and that was completely integrated knowledge. So what's really interesting, and I can answer that question, is he put all of those in his archive. He integrates all of them, showing them, he saw them as one machine. The naval machine, which was very high tech, Versailles, the learning structure, and even the culture structure was all integrated together, which is interesting, isn't it? And one of the things that fascinated me about Colbert is he didn't see a separation between the playwrights, the painters, the diplomats, and the boat makers and the cannon makers. In fact, for him, cannon were really important. So his son is studying physics to understand cannons. And it's all interrelated that he's then going to put on the boat. So yes, this is important. Questions?
Hello, thank you, Professor. This is a really inspiring talk, and I have one question. Who do you think had a greater impact on French history, Georges Eugene Haussmann or Jean-Baptiste Colbert?
Wait, who's the first one? Who's the first person?
Is Georges Eugene Haussmann.
I don't actually know who that is, so
Oh,
please tell us who that is.
this is sorry.
So Colbert is so big, it's hard to explain. He invents every major institution in France. He builds Versailles. He is behind the whole cultural enterprise. His presence, there are these people in history. You have to study structures in history, cultures, empires, all popular culture. But there are these single people that make enormous marks on us. And Colbert is still making a mark today. So over and over again, yesterday when we were driving through Macau, I asked the driver to slow down because I wanted to take a picture of the giant French building in the middle of Macau. You've got Venice, you've got the Big Ben thing, you've got all this stuff, all the gold, and in the middle is a kind of imitation of French architecture, a gigantic vision of France. That is Colbert's footprint. But Colbert's footprint is also here with you in research and all these other things. Because in the end, other states would copy France, states like America, that would create what I call a knowledgeable state, a sophisticated state. And that's why states have state opera houses and things like that. He starts pioneering this idea of the state as a center for culture and knowledge, not just making weapons, but doing all of these things together. And again, having that interplay. So he's extremely, extremely important for even all of us here in Asia today. And one of the things that the case I wanted to make is that he's always seen as the enemy of wealth and the enemy of free trade. And yet if you study East Asian wealth creation, it looks a lot like more like what Colbert did. And for the first time in East Asia, you're also seeing dreams and desires emerge. The Koreans were good at it. The Japanese have their own weird way of doing it. Hong Kong has desire attached to it. Now, for the first time with the electric cars, Big China has it too. People want these cars so much that other countries are refusing to let them in. There's desire for these cars. So much desire, just like in the 17th and 18th centuries, people say, if we let these electric cars in, we'll have no cars soon. And so they're closing their borders. Now, would it work to let the Chinese cars in immediately? I don't know. That's a hard question. But there is now desire coming from China. And I believe with the current political situation, there might be more. So it's very interesting. We're at a turning point, you guys, a big turning point.
Oh, yeah, if you can wait for the mic, yep. Oh, just there in the middle. Yep, gentleman in the white t-shirt.
Hey, thank you very much for the... I'm just curious, I have two interesting questions, actually. I think back to the sentence where you mentioned culture creates wealth. Do you actually agree with that? And if so, do you think this is going to last long, especially how technology is advancing, and it's extraordinarily good. Also, I also have another interesting question, and that is how Britain, we still have the kings and queens, the whole empire, but why do we not have it in France right now? Yeah.
Let me answer the first question, because we got the French Revolution in France. The king gets overthrown, and a lot of the reason is because Louis XIV bankrupts the country and rules. He persecutes people, he puts people in jail, and people don't like it. And so there's a French Revolution. And that French Revolution led to a series of revolutions which span the entire world, which then make their way to China and East Asia, and you get revolutionary culture around the world. So it's a big thing that the French also invent and is related to this. Do I think that culture, you guys, culture's huge, right? People adopting culture. America, we had a question the other day, America has dominated modern culture in a remarkable way, but that's changing. And for example, in a place like California, the role of South Korea in the minds of young Americans is huge. That's unthinkable 25 years ago. The idea that young Americans would be idolizing East Asians. And for American East Asians, it's a huge, important moment that they're being idolized by Americans. But I think this is an important shift. I mean, it's something that no one had imagined happening before. So culture, I mean, people then want things from your culture. And I've noticed that a lot of these famous Koreans end up as models and end up in movies and end up in Squid Game. And then they go back to being models from Squid Game. I follow how this works. The relationship of the French luxury companies to the Korean culture machine is absolutely crazy. You know, it's really big. So culture really matters, selling culture. But also selling, we could call what we're doing culture. This is a giant asset that you have, this university, right? And so people desire it. They want to come here. I've wanted to come here. For me, it's a huge honor to be here. So the way I look at Hong Kong and the way, so when my university heard that I got this honor, they were so excited about it because in the way we value universities, having a university of a high quality recognize one of your faculty members means that your university is great. So there is this kind of exchange of prestige and knowledge and greatness. So culture really matters. Really matters. And if it doesn't matter, we're in trouble. Because what we're celebrating is not people, it's research, it's learning, and it's teaching, right? And so we're actually honoring the thing that we all do together, this collective enterprise, that then enriches, as again, the city, the country, and then the whole world. The whole world benefits from these things. So I really believe in this idea, and this is the good part of this Colbert vision. But we had one more question in there. What was it? What did I miss?
The tech part, I think.
Oh yeah, tech will change everything. And what's really interesting is that people dream of America because they dream of tech. And then, you know, we start seeing China just emerge with more tech, and how people will deal with that culturally is going to be extremely interesting. And also the recent events going on in the United States how will people dream of the United States after what's going on? America still sells a dream, and it sells it at a very high price to foreign students, right? Can it still sell that dream? And by the way, this is something this university also sells, this remarkable dream of having this wonderful global education in this super amazing city. It's a dream, and you get to do all these incredible things, and you have people who went to this university that achieved great things. So it's a tradition, but it's also about dreaming, which is about creating new things. So will tech change that? Yes. Now, AI could make us all irrelevant, or it could be a tool we use to better the world. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't think anybody does. In the meantime, we need to keep learning and being creative. Great questions.
Oh, okay. I'll start over there.
Thank you for your very inspiring speech. You mentioned that Louis XIV eventually chose war because to win the competition against the Spanish and the British. So I want to ask, what is Colbert's strategy to make France in advantage or subjugate like its enemies, right? Because Louis XIV say, I want war and create a hegemony, but what's Colbert's strategy?
Colbert knew that it cost too much money, and then it destroyed things. Now, obviously, some people get rich from war. Most people don't, right? But some people get really rich from war. There is innovation in war. There is no question about this. There's also mass death, total destruction. And Colbert was really worried about it, but he was in a proto-authoritarian regime, and he kept his mouth shut. But he was extremely unhappy about it because he was building these things, and suddenly the money went from science and hiring these people and focusing on that to land war. Also, he believed that power was going to be won at sea in empires. And so he was building this navy. When he died in 1683, France had the biggest navy in the world. Some people have said their ships weren't as good as the English ships, but they were really good. Had they kept focusing on that, things would have gone differently. But Louis focused on dynastic, narcissistic ground war. It was unnecessary war. Colbert, we could call colonialism also perhaps not necessary, questionable, dangerous, immoral, but it happened. And Colbert saw that as the future. And in the end, France comes in second, but it's Britain that ends up focusing on its navy and taking over the world. So, yeah. Good questions. Is that a question back there? Yes.
Wait a minute. So due to time constraints, we only have we have enough time for one last question.
We have 3 questions over there.
All right, lucky draw. Here we go.
Where's the mic?
Where's the mic? The mic's over there.
Yeah, do you want to just...
Yeah, we'll maybe start. Just go there, yeah.
To the
Hello. Thank you, Professor Soll, for answering the question. So a lot of what you've talked about is the cultural aspect of developing the economy. And for the examples you gave for modern China's development, a lot was made of, for instance, the EV market and like DeepSeek AI. But I want to talk about China's cultural development, or China's cultural power. I think globally right now, China is not very close to the status of its neighbors like South Korea or Japan in terms of having cultural power outside of its borders. It's very much closed off, and even with the opening of the latest movie, Ne Jia 2, which had the largest animated movie opening ever, I think most of the cultural exports well, to put it simply, there haven't been many cultural exports from China. Do you think that for China, developing its cultural exports and its cultural superpower status will be vital to its continued development?
I can't predict the future, so maybe AI will just be brains sitting in little beakers of fluid. I don't know what, if we'll even be wearing, who knows where we're going, but history has shown us that yes, that kind of power is enormous. And you can see that is something that Korea can still, for example, draw on. Japan might have its economic problems, but it's a huge center for cinema, for writing, for fashion, for design. And so China, this is a big opening for China right now as America struggles and closes itself off. So I believe that this is an opening for China to get involved with these things. And that's a complicated path. I don't know how that happens, but for me it seems a remarkable opportunity. There seems to be an opening right now. And there also seems, I think, in East Asia, a growing desire for things that are from East Asia. It's great to have global desire and to share things together, but I think there's a huge amount of room. I do think that Hong Kong should still be a place for that. Hong Kong cinema, for example, was a place that made people dream, and still when you watch these movies, there's this incredible desire for Hong Kong. That's something that I believe that this city in particular can play a huge role in doing, and I hope it continues to do that. Great question.
Thank you so much, Professor McManus. You may return to your seat. Professor Soll, please remain standing on the stage. To express our appreciation for Professor Soll's visit, we have prepared a special souvenir for him. May I now invite Professor Stephen Wong, our college head, and Professor Helen Meng, chairperson of the Distinguished Visiting Scholar Committee, to present the souvenir to Professor Soll. This commemorative item is a Chinese calligraphy work that displays the famous quote by Sima Qian, the author of the records of the Grand Historian. It means, by studying the relationship between the heaven and man, and looking through the changes that have taken place from ancient to present times, one can form his personal opinion. To explore the connections between the heaven and humanity, and to comprehend the transformations throughout history. Thank you so much. And please take a photo together. May I now invite the college management, members of the Distinguished Visiting Scholar Committee, and all our esteemed guests to a stage for a group photo. Please join us on stage. Thank you. Please be seated. Thank you all for attending this wonderful lecture. On behalf of United College, I wish you a pleasant evening ahead.